Dear friends, we are back with another episode in the series on structural geology. In this episode, we are going to discuss about joints. Joints are brittle fractures, but not necessarily due to the application of directed compressive stress. Some of the joints that we observe on rocks, the joints that we observe in rocks are products of primary deformation, that is, they develop in a rock during the crystallization of magma either at depth or on the surface. Primary joints are thus indicative of the shrinking, the cooling down of the magmatic forces. Secondary joints, on the other hand, are formed like faults during the application of directed stress or during deformation. The secondary joints form in two different ways and they are named accordingly. Now, let us discuss about what is a joint. To be very frank, there is no definitive definition of joints. Joints, as different from its dictionary meaning, are actually fractures that run across rocks and not join them. Joints are fractures with movement of the two blocks perpendicular to the fractures, or they may represent very small or practically no displacement along them. Joints can be classified on the basis of their time of origin in the rock. The first classification of joints is into two types: primary joints, joints that develop in a rock when the rock is cooling down, an igneous rock is cooling down from the molten state either below the earth's surface or on the earth's surface. Joints may be also produced immediately after cooling and exposure to the aerial erosion, the weathering processes. So, without any application of directed stress. Thus, joints that are named or classified as primary joints may form either during the cooling or immediately after cooling when subjected to erosion. The second variety of joints that form as a result of application of directed stress, secondary joints or diastrophic joints, are fractures that may form in two different ways. We will be discussing in some detail about the orientation of the joints in relation to the direction of applied stress under the principles of rock deformation, how they form. Secondary joints may form either perpendicular to the applied directed stress. In that case, they are called tension joints, or they may form in a similar way as faults, that is, parallel to the planes on which the shear stresses are maximum and form as shear fractures. Primary joints, let us now go on to describe some of the varieties of primary joints. In plutonic magmatic bodies, as the magma moves up, joints may develop perpendicular to the direction of movement or parallel to the rock boundary, parallel to the boundary of the pluton. Thus, they are called flat lying joints. There may be primary joints in a pluton that develop parallel to the direction of movement of the magma, which are known as longitudinal joints. They may develop perpendicular to the direction of movement of the magma when they are called transverse joints. Those primary joints that develop in a plutonic rock when it is being emplaced at an angle to the direction of movement are called oblique or diagonal joints. When a magma comes to the surface and flows in the form of a lava or intrudes as a seal at a very shallow depth, when it cools, a number of points or nuclei of crystallization develops on the moving lava or the seal. The contraction during cooling develops several polygonal joints, several sets of joints, breaking up the surface of the rock into a number of polygonal system of joints, resulting in hexagonal column. The exposed joints, columnar joints, they appear as if somebody has chiseled out these columns out of the solid rock. At the Antrim coast of Ireland, the Giant's Causeway is possibly the best example of columnar joints. Columnar joints can also be observed in the coastal regions of Karnataka in off the coast of Mangalore, where the Deccan traps have been cooling very quickly and producing columnar joints. While on the subject of primary joints, the next type of joints that we will be discussing are the ones that are produced especially on plutonic rocks during erosion or exposure to the weathers. In rocks, especially granitic rocks, the surface gets heated during the day and gets cooled during the night. This alternate heating and cooling causes the formation of joint planes or fractures that sculpt or model the surface of the exposed granitic pluton. The granitic pluton, by the development of these fracture planes due to weathering, are gradually peeling off, and become more and more rounded. Because of this development of joints due to alternate heating and cooling during the day and the night, the joints that develop are called sheeting or exfoliating joint. Exfoliation is the process by which the outer shells of the granitic pluton, they peel off like the peeling of onions. The primary joints produced in a rock either during crystallization at depth in plutonic rocks or at the surface in the form of columnar joints, or subsequent to the cooling due to weathering and erosion, alternate heating and cooling producing sheeting or exfoliation, are characteristics of igneous rocks. We next move on to joints developed as a result of deformation or applied directed stress. We will first discuss how they form. Joints, as we have already discussed, are fractures with movement, slight movement perpendicular to the fracture plane and with practically no displacement along the fracture plane. Joints may develop in a rock when stress is applied to it either perpendicular to the direction of maximum extension. These joints are known as tension joints or tension fractures. Joints may also develop in rocks as a result of applied directed stress parallel to the planes of maximum shear stress as a conjugate set of fractures with an angle of approximately 60 degrees between them, and this angle is bisected by the greatest principal stress axis. These will be clearer when we discuss the principles of rock deformation later. The conjugate sets of joints developing parallel to the planes of maximum shear stress in response to applied directed stress are generally developed in pairs. However, it is not always that both the sets are present. A single set may also develop. The extension joints are of two kinds. Extension joints that develop perpendicular to the direction of maximum tension as a result of applied directed stress, they may be planar fractures, or they may appear as lenticular fractures which are later filled up by material coming up from below. The latter, the lenticular fractures, are also known as gash fractures or tension gashes. The tension gashes usually are related to major shear planes or shear zones like fault planes. We will be shortly describing the relation between them, and because they are displaced by these shear zones, the sense of displacement along these shear zones, these tension gashes generally assume a carved shape, either Z or S shaped or dextral sinistral, as discussed during folding and faulting. The tension gashes, the sinistral and dextral tension gashes, and another set of tension fractures that develop with relation to faults are very good indicators of the movement direction along the faults or shear zones. Now we will be discussing some of the features that develop on joint surfaces, both primary and secondary, before we move on to the relation between joints and other secondary structure, other diastrophic structure. Now that we have seen how joints may form in a rock at the primary stages, that is during crystallization of magma or lavas, and by weathering without any application of directed stress, and then during deformation during application of directed stress, we will move on to the relationship between the secondary joints or diastrophic joints and other secondary structures like folds and faults. But before going into that, let us discuss some of the features found on the fracture surface or joint surface. On the joint surface, several lines appear to be radiating from a point or radiating from a central axis. These lines on a joint surface are very well developed in fine grained and homogeneously composed rocks like basalt, an igneous rock, or in shell, clay stones and mudstones are sedimentary rocks. These feather like structures radiating from a point or a central axis are known as plumose structures because of their similarity to a bird's feather. The lines are also known as hackles, and the structure sometimes referred to as hackle plumes. These hackle plumes and the ribs that develop across them, they are indicative of the progressive development of the joint surface. Next, we move on to the relationship between joints formed by diastrophism or secondary joints and other structures formed by the application of directed stress like folds and faults. Faults are shear fractures, and while they are developing, there may be a set of tension joints developing together with it simultaneously during the same deformation. Incidentally, joint planes which are mutually parallel or approximately parallel to one another form one joint set, and if in an area there are several such sets, the entire array of joints are called a joint system. There may be systematic joints or there may be non-systematic joint sets that develop randomly at various angles to one another. The tension joints, extension joints, I will repeat, the joints that develop perpendicular to the maximum tension developed in a rock as a result of applied directed compressive stress, they develop at an angle to the shear fracture. As will be evident from our discussion on rock deformation on stress and strain, while we discuss stress and strain, it will be clear how the shear fractures or faults, they develop at an angle to the direction of maximum compression, and the tension fractures, they develop perpendicular to the direction of maximum extension. Thus, there is always an approximate angle of 40 to 45 degrees between these two fractures. The extension fractures, planar tension joints that develop together with the fault plane, a brittle shear fracture, appear as the hairs of a feather against the central barb represented by the shear fracture or fault. The similarity of these two structures to the venation on a leaf has led to the naming of these structures as pinnate fractures. Pinnate fractures are thus extension joints that develop together with the large scale brittle fracture or fault and occur simultaneously in the form of the venation of a leaf. The characteristic or importance of these pinnate fractures is that they have a typical acute angle relationship with the major shear fracture or fault. The acute angle between these two always point towards the direction of displacement. Thus, even if the pinnate fractures or tension joints develop on one block on any one side of the fault plane, the acute angle between them gives the structural geologist a very good tool, a very good indication to find out the direction of displacement, even if no other marker horizon, no other planar structures are available. We have also mentioned in the earlier part of this discussion how tension fractures that are lenticular in shape develop within a zone of shearing, especially in case of ductile shear zones. These extensional fractures that are lenticular in shape develop and are deformed into either dextral or sinistral shapes depending on the sense of movement along the shear zone. The acute angle relationship between the shear fractures developed together with the pinnate fractures in case of brittle shears and the tension gash fractures that develop in ductile shear zones, the acute angle relationship is the same. The acute angle always points towards the direction of movement along the shear fracture, be it a brittle fracture like a fault or a ductile shear zone. The tension gashes thus are very good indications of the stress scenario during the formation of the entire structure, and they also help in identifying the sense of displacement along the shear zones. Next, we will move on to the relationship of tension fractures, tension joints and shear joints developed in relation to folds. When applied directed stress, especially applied parallel to the layering, producing buckle or flexure slip folds, act on layers causing the development of folds. At the final stages of deformation, fractures, both tension fractures and shear fractures may develop. The tension fractures and shear fractures that develop subsequently to the folding of a layer are classified according to their orientation. In previous decades, the relationship between the joints, both tension joints and shear joints with the fold, was described in terms of their angularity or the relationship between the joints and the parts of the fold. The joints that developed parallel to the axial plane and also parallel to the hinge line on a fold were called longitudinal joints. Joints that develop perpendicular to the hinge line and also perpendicular to the axial plane were called transverse joints. Joints that acted or developed at an angle to the axial planes were called oblique or diagonal joints. The oblique or diagonal joints were of two kinds. These are shear fractures that develop in response to the applied directed stress at an angle to the direction of maximum compression. The conjugate sets of joints might either intersect parallel in a line parallel to the hinge line or may intersect in a line perpendicular to the hinge line. These sets, these oblique or diagonal joints, were called HKL and 0KL joints in the previous classifications. In modern terminology, the terms longitudinal transverse and oblique or diagonal joints have been replaced by AC joints, BC joints and oblique fractures. The AC and BC, this terminology results from the fact that an imaginary set of orthogonal coordinate axes are now identified, so that the relationship between the fold and the joints can be established. The three coordinate axes A, B and C are described thus. B is a line lying on the layer and parallel to the hinge line. A is a line lying on the layer and perpendicular to B, while C is a line perpendicular to both A and B, that is perpendicular to the layering. Those joints that occur parallel to the AC plane are called AC joints. Those that develop parallel to the BC plane are called BC joint. If we compare it with the previous nomenclature, we can see that the BC joints are same as the longitudinal joints, whereas AC joints are same as the transverse joint. Another set of joints that develop at an angle to both A and B and contains C, and some other joints that make low angle with the bedding plane may also develop in conjugate sets. These are believed to be shear fractures, while the AC and BC joints are believed to be tension fractures. However, it must be kept in mind that this may be a bit of oversimplification, because joints may develop at all possible stages. Though they now are found associated with the fold, it is not necessary that they formed during the same deformation as the fold. They might have been present in the rocks earlier and have been deformed together with the layer when it formed the fold, or they may post date the folding. After the fold have formed, the joints may develop. So, unless we find out precisely the sense of displacement along the fault, along the joints, along the fracture planes, it is not right to jump to a conclusion that AC and BC joints are tension fractures and all oblique joints are shear fractures. We have been discussing that the joints may form at any stage in the life history of a rock. It may form during or immediately after sedimentation, it may form during cooling of a magma and during weathering, and it may form during the tectonic deformation of the rock. Thus, the history of jointing is very important to understand the evolutionary history of the rock. Joints play a very important role in understanding the tectonic scenario. In sedimentary rocks, joints may develop in two stages: during burial and during uplift and erosion, and in other rocks it may develop during the tectonic deformation. Tectonic joints, they also may develop in different stages of the deformation. Tectonic joints may develop in the initial stages when the rock is being deformed at a shallow level. Then as the rock is buried at depth, ductile deformation starts, and at the close of the ductile deformation phase, the rock may fail by brittle failure, causing the development of joints. The tectonic joints thus can develop at any stage of deformation and should be looked at carefully to understand the time of formation of the joint in relation to the applied directed stress. In this episode, we have discussed about a second type of brittle fractures called joints. As in case of faults, the more important type of brittle fracture, joints are a very important tool in the hands of structural geologists, because joints help us in understanding the complete history. How? We have seen in the discussion that joints may develop in a rock at all possible stages. It may form in a sedimentary rock during burial, it may form in a sedimentary rock during uplift and erosion, it may form in an igneous rock during cooling at depth or at the surface, it may develop on a plutonic rock when the plutonic rock is exposed to weathering and erosion. Joints may form in different stages of tectonic deformation before the folding or ductile deformation starts, during the ductile deformation stage, or post dating the ductile deformation stage. Thus, the careful study of joints and their surfaces, the displacements along them, helps a structural geologist to identify the complete history, the complete tectonic history of the area where the rocks have developed. Now that we have discussed about all the structures that form in a rock, either in the primary stages or during tectonic deformation, the ductile structures, the brittle structures, and how they are related to one another, we will now move on to, in our next two episodes, on the concept of rock deformation, the principles of rock deformation. We will first be discussing about the stress and strain conditions, the basic principles of it, and then we will move on to the factors that control rock deformation in some detail.